Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. This time, we're taking a look at something that's both kind of spooky and surprisingly relevant to all of us, I think, the influence of the supernatural.
Ooh, okay.
You sent over this really fascinating episode of the ChattBOX podcast called The Supernatural Influence, exploring the interplay of beliefs in our daily lives.
Okay.
And I got to admit, I'm already hooked just from the description.
I was intrigued by this one too. It's interesting how they go beyond the typical ghosts and goblins to highlight the broader impact.
Right.
Like it's about those big questions we've always struggled with as humans. The meaning of life, our place in the universe, what happens after we die.
Yeah, for sure. And right off the bat, they define the supernatural as anything that goes beyond the natural world. So we're talking deities, spirits, mystical forces, all that good stuff.
Right.
But what really struck me was their point about these beliefs being around since, like, the beginning of humanity. It's not just spooky stories by the campfire. It's, like, woven into our cultures and, like, our very psyches, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. The podcast makes a really compelling case for how ancient cultures used the supernatural to explain things they couldn't understand. Think about early civilizations trying to make sense of natural disasters, diseases, or even just the cycle of life and death.
Right.
Without science, these events must seem like the work of powerful, unseen forces.
It makes sense.
Yeah.
And those explanations, as different as they might be across different cultures, they really shaped those cultures. From rituals and traditions to morals and even social hierarchies, the supernatural was influencing how societies were structured and how people interacted, both with each other and the world around them.
It's amazing how those ancient beliefs still echo in our modern world. I
Yeah.
mean, we may not blame storms on angry gods anymore, but we still grapple with those questions of fate, our purpose, morality.
Totally.
The podcast suggests that it's this deep human need to find meaning and order in a world that often feels chaotic.
Yeah. I mean, even the most skeptical among us probably find themselves knocking on wood sometimes or avoiding walking under a ladder. Speaking of which, the podcast dives into superstitions. They talk about how these beliefs that maybe don't have scientific proof still play a big role in our lives. It's like we're looking for a little control in situations that feel uncertain. They point out how superstitions are everywhere, from lucky numbers to rituals for warding off evil. And you find them in pretty much every culture.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, how those superstitions persist even without that scientific backing. It makes you think they must tap into something deeper, a psychological need for comfort maybe, especially when we're dealing with stuff beyond our control.
Exactly. They made a great point about how these superstitions pop up most when we feel vulnerable.
Right.
Like you're about to take a big exam. Maybe wearing your lucky shirt won't actually help you pass, but it might boost your confidence a bit, give you that sense of comfort.
Exactly, that psychological comfort. Even if it's based on something you can't prove, it can still impact how we behave and make decisions.
Absolutely. But it's not all Lucky Charms and blank cats, is it? The podcast takes this really interesting turn when they start talking about multiple dimensions, like those unseen realms that exist beyond what we can perceive. Things start to get a little mind-bending at this point.
It is kind of mind-blowing, isn't it? And the podcast connects this idea, which we usually think of as sci-fi, to both philosophy and science. Philosophers have been thinking about these unseen realms for ages. And then you have physics, specifically string theory, which suggests our universe might have more dimensions than we can see.
Okay, hold on. String theory. For those of us who haven't cracked open a physics textbook in a while, could you maybe give us a quick breakdown of that?
Sure. String theory is a super complex model in theoretical physics. And basically, it suggests that the fundamental building blocks of the universe aren't particles, but these tiny vibrating strings. And these strings exist in multiple dimensions, most of which are curled up and totally invisible to us.
Wow.
It's a wild concept, but it's one that physicists have been exploring for decades.
So how does this all tie back to the supernatural?
Well, the podcast proposes a pretty intriguing idea. What if some of those paranormal experiences we hear about, the stuff that seems to defy scientific explanation, are actually glimpses into these unseen dimensions?
Whoa.
Could it be that ghosts or spirits or other unexplainable phenomena are just, energies or entities from these other realms interacting with ours?
Okay, now that is spooky. The idea that we could be brushing up against other realities in our daily lives is both terrifying and kind of exhilarating.
Right. It makes you question what's really out there. What are the limits of our perception?
Exactly. And speaking of questioning things, the podcast shifts gears to a concept that's been shaping civilizations for millennia,
Ah.
heaven and hell. What I found interesting is how they approach this not just as a religious belief, but like a powerful moral framework, influencing how we act right now.
Yeah. They highlight how different beliefs about the afterlife can function like a moral compass.
Right.
So you have the Christian idea of heaven and hell versus the Buddhist concept of rebirth. The details are different, but both shape our understanding of right and wrong, reward and punishment.
And even if we don't consciously buy into these beliefs, they can still seep into our collective understanding.
Right.
They influence our laws, traditions, even our personal choices. Do we act kindly hoping for a reward in heaven, or avoid certain actions because we're afraid of eternal damnation? It's powerful stuff, even if we don't always realize it's there.
It really is. It makes you wonder, doesn't it?
Definitely. And I feel like we've only just scratched the surface here.
Oh, we haven't even gotten to angels and demons yet.
Oh, right. Those are always fascinating topics. But before we go there, let's pick this back up in part 2. We'll explore those angelic and demonic forces and how they shape our understanding of good and evil.
Welcome back to our deep dive into all things supernatural. Before the break, we were talking about how beliefs about the afterlife, like heaven and hell, can shape how we act in this life.
Yeah, it's almost like they give us a framework for understanding right and wrong, good and evil. But I'm curious about how people actively engage with those beliefs. The ChattBOX podcast spends some time talking about the role of rituals and practices.
Right. They point out that these rituals can take so many forms, everything from formal religious practices like prayer or meditation to cultural events like festivals or, rites of passage. What's interesting is how those rituals, even if you don't necessarily agree with the specific belief behind them, can still offer a sense of comfort, connection, and even community.
It's like those shared rituals, especially, give us a sense of stability, like grounding us in the face of the unknown. I'm thinking about things like funerals. No matter what your religious beliefs are, those rituals give us a way to process grief, celebrate life, connect with others who are going through the same thing.
Exactly. And even smaller, more personal rituals, like carrying a lucky charm or repeating a mantra, those can help too. Especially in times of stress or uncertainty. They might not actually change the outcome, but they can offer psychological comfort.
Right, that sense of agency. Okay, so we've talked about beliefs about the afterlife, rituals for dealing with the unknown. But what about those specific supernatural beings we hear about in myths and legends? The podcast gets into both angels and demons, and how they kind of embody our hopes and fears, our aspirations for good and anxieties about evil.
Yeah, they start with angels, talking about that traditional role as messengers from the divine, especially in those Abrahamic religions like Christianity and Islam.
Right.
But they also highlight this more modern take on angels
Oh, yeah.
as protectors, guides in our daily lives. It's like they've become more personal, more integrated into our everyday experiences.
I think that's super interesting. It's like, in a world that feels increasingly chaotic, people are looking for comfort in this idea of a benevolent force watching over them, offering guidance, protection.
It makes you wonder if it's a way of making sense of those inexplicable events, those moments where you think, wow, that was lucky, or how did that happen?
Maybe. Like attributing it to something beyond ourselves, a guiding hand, or just, a force that wants good things for us.
Makes you think. Have you ever felt like something angelic was at work in your life? Something you just couldn't explain rationally?
Honestly.
Yeah.
Yeah, there have been a few times when things have just fallen into place so perfectly that it's hard to write it off as just coincidence. But what about the flip side? Demons. The podcast takes a bit of a darker turn when they talk about demons and these dark forces as like the embodiment of our fears and anxieties.
Right. And they make a point of saying that, unlike the comforting presence of angels, demons tap into these primal fears of the unknown, the uncontrollable, the destructive.
Yeah, it's like those horror movies that play on our deep-hate fears. But the podcast goes beyond just scary stories, right? They point out how belief in demons has had real consequences, both historically and even today.
Definitely. Throughout history, people have used demonic forces to explain all sorts of things, from illness and misfortune to, social deviance and mental illness. And it's been used to justify some pretty terrible things: persecution, control, even war.
It's unsettling, isn't it? Like, even if we think we've moved beyond those superstitious interpretations, it's still there under the surface,
Yeah.
shaping how we see things, how we act.
It really makes you think, is there a part of us, even those of us who think we're super rational, that still believes in the possibility of those dark forces? But beyond the literal idea of demons, I think the podcast is encouraging us to think about the metaphorical power of these concepts. Like, what are our own personal demons, the internal struggles, the anxieties that hold us back or tempt us to make bad choices?
That's a powerful way to look at it. It's about recognizing those darker parts of ourselves
Hmm.
and figuring out how to deal with them.
And I think that brings us back to something the podcast really emphasizes:
Okay?
the importance of personal belief systems. Whether those beliefs are rooted in traditional religion or personal experiences or a mix of both, they're the lens we use to understand the world.
They made a really interesting distinction between simply hearing about supernatural stuff and actually having a personal experience that shakes your worldview.
Right, it's one thing to read about ghosts or demons. It's totally different to have an encounter that you just can't explain rationally.
Totally. And those personal experiences, good or bad, often lead to people reevaluating what they believe.
Yeah, trying to reconcile what they already thought with this new information, experiences that challenge their understanding of what's possible, what's real.
Like having to confront the limits of your knowledge, the vastness of the unknown. And those confrontations, even though they can be unsettling, they can also be really liberating, can't they?
For sure, they open your mind to new possibilities, new ways of seeing things, even new ways of understanding yourself. And as we move into the last part of our deep dive, I think it's important to remember that this exploration of the supernatural is really an exploration of ourselves.
I like that.
It's about understanding those deep-seated beliefs and anxieties that shape how we see things, the choices we make, and how we interact with the world.
So as we get ready for our final descent into this topic, let's stay open to those questions, those shadowy corners of our own beliefs. Who knows what we might find down there? All right, welcome back for the final part of our deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground here. Ancient beliefs, superstitions, even multiple dimensions. But there's something that keeps coming back to me. Remember how we talked about our actions, even those everyday choices, being influenced by those deeper beliefs about the supernatural?
Yeah, that's a really interesting idea. We always say our beliefs shape our actions, but what about the other way around? Like, could our everyday choices, the stuff we do almost without thinking, be guided by those beliefs we might not even know we have?
Exactly. Like when you get that gut feeling about something,
Hmm.
that sense of knowing that comes out of nowhere. Or maybe you make a decision that seems kind of illogical but just feels right deep down. Could that be those deeper beliefs about fate, destiny, or even unseen forces kind of nudging us in a certain direction?
The ChattBOX podcast brought up a really interesting point about this. They were talking about people who've had these big life-changing supernatural experiences
Right.
and how afterwards they often make these big choices that align with those experiences. Maybe they switch careers, find a new spiritual path, even move somewhere new because they felt it was a sign.
Yeah, it's like those experiences totally reorient their worldview, whether it's an encounter with angels, a premonition, even just that feeling of being connected to something bigger, it changes them.
Right. And those changes can have this ripple effect.
Oh, for sure.
It's not just their own life, it's their relationships, their community, even how they contribute to the world. Like, it opens up all these new possibilities for them, new ways of seeing things, new ways of being.
The podcast used a really good analogy. They said, these kinds of experiences can be like cracks in the pavement of our lives, disrupting our routine, challenging how we see things, and forcing us to look at the limits of what we think we know.
And through those cracks, something new can come up, a new perspective, a new purpose, maybe a new way of connecting with ourselves and the world around us. It might be disruptive at first, but those cracks can lead to growth, transformation.
It all comes back to personal belief systems, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Whether they're based in traditional religion, personal experience, or a mix of both. They're how we understand the world and our place in it.
And the podcast was really clear about how important those belief systems are. Even if they don't make sense to someone else, they give us a way to grapple with those big existential questions. Questions about meaning, purpose, death, our relationship with the unknown.
And having that framework, whether it's based on science or ancient wisdom or something else, it can give us comfort, stability, especially when the world feels so chaotic. It's like a compass.
Exactly. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I think it's important to remember that exploring the supernatural is also about exploring ourselves.
I like that.
It's about going deeper into our beliefs, those assumptions we might not even realize are there, and seeing how they shape our lives.
So as you go about your day, pay attention to those little hints of the supernatural, those moments where logic and intuition collide, where you feel like there might be something more going on than you can see. Don't be afraid to explore those parts of yourself, the places where your beliefs meet your experiences.
And remember, the supernatural is more than ghosts and spooky stories. It's about that human search for meaning, wanting to connect with something bigger than ourselves, that constant push and pull between what we can see and what we can't. So keep your mind open, stay curious, and always be ready to discover something new.
Until next time, keep it real, keep it fun, and always keep it in the box.